Listen, what I'd like to speak to you about today is our pathology program focused on the row crops. I'm talking dry beans and soybeans in this case. Due to the lack of any significant disease pressure in corn at this point in our evolution in terms of corn production, we don't work a lot with corn yet. Okay, we do a little bit of work with corn, but nothing significant. I would anticipate that as we grow corn more, with time our disease problems will build up there, and then it will become relevant to do more disease management studies on corn in this area. But right now our work is focused on dry beans and soybeans for those crops grown in this area, and on both of those crops we work extensively with Sclerotinia. On dry beans, of course, Sclerotinia is a problem both in dryland and irrigated production. And soybeans, traditionally we think of Sclerotinia as really only a problem in irrigated production, except for a few low spots or hot spots, or maybe a field where you grew tons of sunflowers and got burned a few times. But really it's unusual to have any significant economic losses to Sclerotinia in dryland soybeans. Be aware though that the natto types are quite a bit more susceptible. So there you're much more high risk. And on soybeans we also do quite a lot of seed treatment studies. Okay, I will not talk about seed treatment studies today. And our work up till now on the Sclerotinia, which is what I will talk about today, has focused primarily on testing for fungicide efficacy. Believe it or not, field testing for Sclerotinia, applied management of Sclerotinia, applied research for managing Sclerotinia is really quite limited across the country. And so efficacy data are often very sparse for these fungicides. And while you have multiple fungicides registered, some, as you well know, work a lot better than others. We've done our best to help tease out the ones that worked out the best. I have all those data online. You Google Carrington Research Extension Center, click on the upper left-hand corner, plant pathology, and then select your crop. In this case, let's say it's dry beans. You'll see a section for our fungicide efficacy testing results for anthracnose, for rust, and for Sclerotinia. For Sclerotinia, we have tons of data, and you'll actually see it laid out in parallel to your fungicide guide, okay, by fungicide. And below, within each of those blocks, you'll see a commentary relative to efficacy, what we have seen for efficacy for that fungicide. It's basically my synopsis of what I have concluded. Okay, but if you want to reach your own conclusion, which I would rather you do, you'll have links in there to all of our reports in which that fungicide has been tested. Okay, and there are always two formats. You have a user-friendly report, which it has a illustrated bar graph, typically just disease data and yield, just the key information. Okay, and you look at that, and anyone can interpret that very fast, visually. Okay, if you want more information, like you want test weight, you want kernel weight, whatever, then you need to go to the technical report, which is your traditional tabular format with a bunch of numbers. Okay, and which is perfectly easy to read, but will take you a little bit more time. Okay, so anyhow, the fungicide efficacy data are online. For those of you who have who were here last year, say at the row crop tour, you know we're also doing some work evaluating the strength of partial resistance to Sclerotinia in soybeans. Okay, you know when you buy soybean varieties, that most of the companies have a white mold rating associated with that variety. And what we found for all, we evaluated 6 pairs of soybean varieties from various companies. And in each one of these cases, I asked the company to give me 2 varieties of very similar maturity that differ in the susceptibility to Sclerotinia as you have observed it. That were rated as either partially resistant or more susceptible by the breeders themselves. Okay, and we evaluated them in the field here. They're all 0 maturity, between 0.2 and 0.9. Okay, and what we found was that the partially resistant varieties consistently performed better under high Sclerotinia pressure. Okay, you got better yields, you got better lower disease levels. But the strength of that resistance was highly variable. Okay, and so there were some varieties that were better than the best fungicide I've ever seen. I mean, they were amazing, and they yielded fantastic, okay? But there are other varieties that the difference was just marginal, tiny. And what we found when testing against kind of your average varieties, not anywhere in between, neither of those two extremes, what we found was that you still gained by using a foliar fungicide in irrigated soybeans where sclerotinia was a problem, okay? I think in a dryland production setting where you know the field has some sclerotinia issues, okay, and but the weather isn't enormously favorable for sclerotinia, you're probably going to do very well just using a partially resistant variety. Just know that you're kind of rolling the dice. Some varieties work great and some, well, not so much. And there's really no independent arbiter to let you know. And to be honest, to defend the companies, research done in only places has been done out of South Africa on sclerotinia in soybeans has shown that resistance to sclerotinia in soybeans can differ by the disease pressure. Okay, so a variety that performs very well under, say, in a relative sense, under moderate disease pressure, i.e. it goes to the very top of the pile in terms of its susceptibility to sclerotinia, could very well be middling or even lower half when you get to high sclerotinia pressure in terms of relative ratings. And this makes sense because sclerotinia resistance is not like rust resistance. Okay, this is not conferred primarily by major genes. This is conferred by how does that plant grow primarily. Okay, there are some resistance genes in there, but it's primarily how does that plant grow? How much airflow is going through that canopy? And those factors can change depending on your growing conditions. If you happen to have, depending on the year, the type of characteristics that can permit airflow could be overwhelmed. Like if you just had really favorable conditions and all your soybeans are super duper bushy, well then the soybean variety that when planted, say, a little bit late with conditions that didn't permit really robust growth, that soybean variety, while it might have performed quite well when planted a little bit late and not being so bushy, under other conditions could get overwhelmed. So be aware that those resistance ratings are useful, okay, but they shouldn't be considered, they shouldn't be relied on exclusively when you're anticipating quite a bit of disease, for instance, in irrigated production. The good news is that we saw that the resistance was stable across row spacings, okay, and so it really didn't matter what row spacing you used, okay. At any rate, so that's what we have done up till now. And what we are doing this year is we're continuing efficacy testing of fungicides, trying to identify new compounds, help facilitate the registration of new compounds, etc. Okay, and we continually generating data for registered products. So that database that you have online is going to grow every year. Okay, and the general conclusions that are reached are going to get more and more rigorous each year. What we are doing this year also is that we're really expanding our effort beyond just efficacy testing. And on dry beans, for instance, we really want to nail down the question, when do you need 2 sequential fungicide applications for sclerotinia control, and when can you get away with 1? Okay, and if you can get away with 1, how should that be timed relative to weather conditions? Okay, and so we have a pair of studies to looking at that in which we are simulating rainfall, if you will, by manipulating irrigation. Okay, and if it gets rainy, we're actually equipped to exclude rainfall from the plots with A-frame tents. Okay, and so we will be able to give you a much better guide of, well, let's say the season starts out wet. Okay, and then you only get periodic rain events, say separated by 2 weeks apart, and the soil really dries out between those events. Do you need that second application? We don't really know, okay? But that's a question that we're addressing. Okay, the other question that's really common, especially in dry beans, is okay, it's been really dry, and let's say dry and hot, bloom initiation. Mid-bloom, it's still dry. But as you're moving into that last half, the last third of the bloom period, it starts getting cool and wet. Okay, is it necessary? Is it worthwhile to put on a fungicide for Sclerotinia? You know you're probably going to get some Sclerotinia. But you know also that you've set a lot of your seed already, and you may not get really that much yield loss from that Sclerotinia. Okay, and so in that situation, how much economic return is there to applying the fungicide? Okay, and the experiment right behind you is actually looking at that. If you look out there, you'll see some wet areas, okay, and other dry areas. And the wet areas are where we are establishing disease early. Okay, so we're applying the moisture now, so that as we enter bloom in a couple days, and as that canopy closes, we should get those apothecia, the little mushrooms that produce the Sclerotinia spores. Right away, we should have early disease onset. The dry areas, we're targeting mid-bloom and late bloom for disease onset. Okay, and we'll be testing a traditional fungicide schedule versus a targeted application relative to weather conditions. 1 versus 2 apps in that case. Gets kind of the range of what we're doing this year, a little bit different. Oh, and Sclerotinia on soybeans, something very interesting we saw last year. As you all know, the recommendation on soybeans is to apply your fungicides at early bloom, usually late R1, early R2 growth stage. Okay? And I typically get a phone call or two each year from an irrigated producer who has planted to wide rows and wasn't able to plant early. Okay? So he's entering bloom, and his rows are way apart. Okay? You see tons of ground between the canopy. And he's asking, well, should I put on a fungicide for Sclerotinia? I'm at, early R2. Should be the right timing. And I always intuitively say, I don't think so. Even though you're under irrigation, and you have a history of Sclerotinia in this field, you have lots of air movement through that canopy, I don't think you're going to get disease. I would put it on shortly before the canopy closes. Okay, so last year we tested fungicides on soybeans on narrow, medium, and wide rows. Okay, and 7, 14, 21, and 28 inches between rows. Okay, and it was much like this year. We had a tough spring for planting. Okay, and our soybeans got in within your acceptable window, but not as early as we would have liked. They got in late May, just like we got them in this year, actually. And as we entered bloom, we had lots of space between those rows. We were irrigating, but I looked at that and I said, well, I don't think it's worthwhile to put on the fungicide now. And so we put on the fungicide in the 7 and 14 inch row spacing at the recommended timing because we were really close to canopy closure. But on the 21 inch rows, we ended up putting them on at early R3. Okay, definitely not your textbook recommendation. Okay, and in the 28 inch rows, we put them on actually at early R4. Okay, and what we did on the 21 inch rows is we applied about 3 to 4 days before I thought the canopy would close up. On the 28 inch rows, I missed the boat, and I applied it just as the canopy was closing. We got really phenomenal results from those 21 inch rows. The best disease control for Sclerotinia I've ever seen in soybeans, okay? And the yields were significantly higher than under the narrow row spacings where we applied at R2. Okay, at the 28 inch rows, unfortunately, applying at canopy closure seemed to be too late. We still got comparable results to what we got on those narrow rows, okay, but it was not as good as applying 3 to 4 days before canopy closure. Anyhow, but that really boils down to an anecdotal observation, okay, and it makes tons of sense given the biology. But for rigorous recommendations, what we are doing is we're testing fungicide timing relative to growth stage, i.e. early bloom, or canopy closure, on narrow, medium, and wide row spacings. This is being done here, this block right here, with Tyler Telledy, who's here right now from the Nesson Irrigation Research Site out by Williston, okay, up in Langdon, and also at the Oaks Irrigation Research Site. So hopefully we'll have some rigorous recommendations. Next year, we'll test the same concept on dry edible beans, both navies and pintos. With that, that's all I have. I would encourage everyone to come back for a row crop field day, where you can see a lot of the results with your own eyes.